I'm going to talk about the Karma Kagyu tradition and its system of practice in this short talk. I should clarify right away that the Kagyu tradition, as it's called in Tibetan, the lineage of the four injunctions, originally its original full title, which came about in Tibet through the work of Marpa and Mila and his disciple Gampopa, the three founding Tibetan fathers, who themselves, or Marpa at least, was the heir to Indian masters. This general Kagyu tradition fractured into, or blossomed, one might say, into different groupings, 4 major and 8 minor, as it's often described. And so what we're talking about now is just one of these 4 major traditions, the Karma Kagyu tradition. So there'll be things that are common across all the Kagyu traditions in what I say, and things that are specific to Karma Kagyu. And I should also say, of course, that quite a lot of what one would describe here is common to all the systems of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, beyond that even, some elements are common to all elements of all forms of Buddhism. So it's like that. And also, again, yet another kind of, not caution, but thing to remember, is none of the traditions of Dharma, but particularly the Karma Kagyu, remained isolated. They interacted with and were influenced by other currents of spiritual teaching and practice. So every tradition is recognizable tradition because it has certain characteristic things to do with it expresses the view, the particular meditations it prefers. But there's quite a lot that in which there's a merging with and a blending with other spiritual streams. So they're recognizably independent and distinct, but they share lots of commonalities. So one should say that. Karma Kagyu, by that we mean the tradition of teaching and practice that originated out of the work of the 12th century Tibetan master Karmapa Dusum Jampa. Karmapa, the one of Buddha activities, he was nicknamed. And so he and his successors were named the holders of the Karma Kagyu lineage. So karma in this sense being to do with his name. And he was one of the 4 primary disciples of Gampopa. And Gampopa had already established a way of practicing the Dharma which blended together the Mahayana graduated path system of the Kadampas and the more tantric, or exclusively tantric approach really, of Marpa and Milarepa, focusing on as the pinnacle of teachings, focus on Mahamudra, the Great Seal. So Gampopa unified those two. They said he made the 2 streams of Kadam and Tantric Mahamudra into one stream. And so Dusum Jampa was one of the primary heirs of Gampopa's teaching system. And over the course of time, these Karmapa, of course, later on, there have been 16 successive incarnations of this Lama. The second Karmapa, Karma Pakshi, was the first recognized incarnate Lama in Tibet. Often people wonder why there are not incarnate Lamas recognized before. Well, 2 things about that. One is, in a way, incarnate Lamas are not necessary because Vajrayana is a system of personal transmission from one teacher to another. And the conditions were just not there in India. India was a multiple society in the sense of many different religions. Buddhism was not ever the only one. In fact, it was not even dominant. And even in other places like China too, there are other systems. So there are conditions that were particularly appropriate to Tibet, which became an exclusively Buddhist society by the 13th century, for recognition of so-called incarnate Lamas to happen. Partly it was to do with the great mastery of some of these practitioners who actually had achieved great realization, and partly it's to do with our kind of cultural, economic, even political conditions. Anyway, leaving that aside, Karmapa was the Karmapa's line of incarnations are the dominant, the first ones, and then he was also accompanied by the successive incarnations of the Shama Lamas and other Lamas. All those are the guardians of the Karma Kagyu tradition, particularly the Karmapa and Shamapa successive incarnations, down to the present 17th Karmapa, Tinni. So what about the Karma Kagyu system of practice? How would one identify? And by this I mean to sketch what are the the general distinguishing features which one would engage with if one was to seriously practice this tradition. But again, it's by no means like this is what you've got to do and this is exactly always the same stages. It's not like that. But I'd say this, and it perhaps is important to begin here, like any genuine tradition, any successful tradition of spiritual practice in Dharma, the Kagyu tradition and its system of practice has both a scholarly and meditative aspect. Now, that's probably worth stressing because the Kagyu tradition is often known as Drubju, which means practice lineage, meaning and signifying, of course, a strong emphasis on meditation. The meditation practice is central to this tradition. And some people have even interpreted that to mean there's no emphasis at all on teachings. It's just pure meditation. But that's not true. As Gampopa said, whoever practices meditation without receiving the teachings, the instructions, is completely blind. Nothing can come from that. So the Kagyu too, that's the yoga, the practice tradition, is one that is in its way of training people. It emphasizes both elements, study and practice. So as for the study, to deal with that quite quickly, it's perhaps not as extensive. It would be true to say the Kagyu, generally in the Kagyu tradition, is not quite as much emphasis as, for instance, in Sakya tradition. But what are the key things that you would have to study if you're going to successfully practice in the Kagyu way? Well, I would say the foundation text for the Kagyus is the text composed by Gampopa himself back in the early 12th century, which is the Tapo Taijin, as we call it, the jewel ornament of Dagpopa, Dagpopa being another name of Gampopa. The jewel ornament of liberation, to give it the name it's most familiar with nowadays in the West. Gampopa's work is a master work. It doesn't have much to do with the Vajrayana practices, it's true, but as an exposition of the common Dharma of Hinayana and Mahayana, it's incomparable. Well, it's comparable to Sakyapandita's Tupi Gongsal in a way, the premier Lamrim text of the Sakyas, and it's based upon the first of all Lamrim texts written in Tibet, the text of Atisha is called the Lamp of the Path. But it's a huge work, and blended together the teachings on Buddha nature with the Lamrim of Atisha, going from the four thoughts to turn the mind to Dharma, through refuge, bodhicitta, 6 perfections, up to the level of Buddhahood, but expressed in a uniquely Kagyu way. So influenced by Milarepa, even though not explicitly tantric, but as Atisha himself, as Gampopa himself signifies it being a text, is dedicated both to Atisha and to Jetsun Milarepa. So if you couldn't study anything else as a support for your Kagyu practice, the jewel ornament would be indispensable. But if you are able to study more with your lamas, then a second work which would then be very applicable would be the text called the Supreme Continuity, or Uttara Tantra Shastra, which is a work composed by, well, in a way, delivered by the Bodhisattva Maitreya, written down in India by Asanga, and which is the greatest kind of exposition of the whole doctrine of Buddha nature. So all the 4 traditions of Tibetan Dharma preserve this work, but it's especially important for Karma Kagyu because the Karma Kagyu, one of the kind of unique aspects of the Karma Kagyu is the way, as Gampopa himself suggested, Buddha nature teaching and the Mahamudra teaching on nature of mind have a kind of natural connection that through the Buddha nature teaching one can quickly grasp the point. One can grasp the point of the Mahamudra teaching, even if one was not to be able to practice the tantric methods. This is a kind of important and rather special point that Gampopa made. So the study of the Jude Lama, the Supreme Continuity, would be a very important foundational text, especially if you were able to study it with the commentary of Jamgon Control. Equally, kind of in a way tagged on to the Jude Lama, if you could study them, would be the two texts of the third Karmapa, Ranjan Dorji, discriminating consciousness and primordial wisdom, Namsheshi Jepa, and he's showing the Buddha nature, Nimpo Tempa. These are like further expositions of the Buddha nature teaching. And in the Tantra, in the terms of intellectual resources for the Tantras, two further works by the third Karmapa, Ranjan Dorji, would be useful. His commentary on the Vajra Tent Tantra, Dorji Gur Tantra, and his work called Zamonangidan, the innermost essence, innermost meaning, the profound innermost meaning. So those would be, in a way, the kind of key intellectual teachings for Kagyu practitioner. But of those, the first two, Tapo Tajin, Dual Honors Liberation, and the Jude Lama would be really, more or less, indispensable if you were to get a good intellectual basis for your practice. Now, turning to practice, the Kagyu tantric so to talk in terms of practice, really, where does Kagyu practice begin? Well, it begins actually in a way with its key practice, which is Mahamudra. Kagyu practitioners are kind of connected with Mahamudra fairly rapidly because they usually begin their diet of practice, so to speak. Well, they might begin it actually with meditating on a tantric deity like Chenrezig, the embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas. But they would also pretty soon, if not at the same time, begin to practice the Nunro, the preliminary practices of Mahamudra, which are the practice. The outer Nunro is the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. Then the inner Nunro is the practice of this mixed Sutra and Tantra sequence of practices, beginning with taking refuge, but repeated 100,000 times, reciting the formula of refuge, together with making prostrations 100,000 times, making a bodhisattva vow in terms of a session of practice, reciting the mantra and visualizing the deity Vajrasattva to purify negativities, offering a symbolic mandala 100,000 times, offering it to the lineage lamas for the benefit of all beings, and practicing the Guru Yoga, again with an element that's done 100,000 times. So Kagyu practitioners more or less always embark upon those preliminaries for Mahamudra at the early on in their spiritual career, if you like, a spiritual life. And at the end of the Nunro, then in one way there's completing the Nunro in a way creates the necessary purification, the necessary enrichment by merit, and the necessary strengthening of blessings to enable you to practice Mahamudra. But now there's an important point that arises, and that's to do with the nature of Mahamudra itself and how it's to be understood and practiced. Gampopa felt that the Mahamudra that he'd received from Milarepa, which was a teaching seen as part of the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, the Supreme Yoga Tantra, in fact seen as the pinnacle of the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, and dependent on you having received the appropriate initiations and practicing a Anuttara Yoga deity like Vajrayogini or Chakkasamvara, and practicing the completion stage practices, the subtle body yogas. Gampopa thought that Mahamudra, the way he was taught by Milarepa, could be supplemented, or a different route to Mahamudra could be provided without using those tantric teachings. And that was through the teaching of the Jude Lama, none other than the Jude Lama, and the gradual path practices of the Kadampas. So Gampopa, in a way, developed this idea that, or this view, that two approaches, a purely tantric approach and a non-tantric approach to Mahamudra, could be developed. Now, nowadays, so to speak, it's difficult to generalize about these things because lamas have different opinions about it. But generally speaking, as one was most normally practice it nowadays, the Karma Kagyu system of practice is in a way kind of represents a blend of these different perspectives. So what I mean by that is that even to do the Nundro, which I've just described, the preliminaries to Mahamudra, to do them effectively, you would need to have received an initiation, at least that would qualify you to practice the Guru Yoga. Because the Guru Yoga, in a way, is simply repeating what happened in the initiation, the transference of blessings from the initiation, repeating it as a daily meditation practice on your own. So obviously, therefore, you can't effectively practice that if you've not had the seed planted in you at the time of initiation. You can't cultivate a seed unless it's been planted. So even the Nundro requires an initiation. So the Nundro, as I described it, is like a mixture of sutra practices and tantric practices. And it might well be the case that having completed the Nundro, you do further Guru Yoga practices. That's very common in Karma Kagyu, to practice the Guru Yogas of Marpa. There's a Guru Yoga of Marpa, a Guru Yoga focused on Milarepa, and a Guru Yoga focused on the Gampopa. And there are Guru Yogas also focused on the Karmapas, such as the Guru Yoga of the 8th Karmapa, or the Guru Sadhana of the 2nd Karmapa, Karma Pakshi, or even more simply, a Guru Yoga of the 16th Karmapa. All such Guru Yogas exist and can be practiced at the end of your Nundro to strengthen your ability to receive and practice Mahamudra. So, how it would happen then in somebody's, the general career of a Karma Kagyu practitioner is, at the very initial level, they may well have received various initiations for deities like Chenrezig, Manjushri, and so on, and practice them. Like, for instance, quite common in Kagyu to practice the form of Manjushri called lion speech Manjushri. That's a very short practice to do to develop some kind of initial wisdom. Practice Chenrezig. Chenrezig is very popular in Karma Kagyu, and the deity Amitabha, his practice is very popular. And alongside that, or parallel with it, to practice the Mahamudra Nundro. Then at the end, as I say, these more detailed Guru Yogas. And then, in a way, we come to the more advanced levels of Karma Kagyu practice. And there are kind of twin tracks there, one could say. So let me explain what I mean by that. Ostensibly, having finished the Mahamudra Nundro, it qualifies you for the main part, the Nushi, as we call it, the main essential parts of the Mahamudra. And a practitioner with great devotion to his or her personal Lama at this time, the devotion that's been very strengthened perhaps by their practice of Guru Yoga, it's said in the Karma Kagyu tradition that through this devotion alone, there can be what is called like the Yeshipo, the blessing of the transference of wisdom. Meaning like the wisdom, the realization that the Lama has of his or her mind, as none other than Mahamudra, can in some way trigger off the Lama, the disciple, the student, to realize spontaneously the nature of their own mind, to again see the Mahamudra nature of their own mind. So it's not like the blessing is an entity which is taken from one mind to the other. The transference means more like triggering off. And this, of course, is a description of dependent origination. What arises always from the appropriate causes and conditions. So that, in a way, that's the whole point of the devotion, that the devotion to the Lama is like, and the blessing of the Lama is like a hook and a ring, and they, through the coming together, the ring and the hook, the Mahamudra realization could be born in the disciple's mind, because it was existing already in the Lama's mind. So that is a really key element to the Kagyu system, and why Kagyu system is known very much for its stress on Mugu, or devotion. And I mean, devotion is of course present in all the Vajrayana traditions, because it's said that the Lama is of course none other than the union of the three jewels. The Lama from whom one receives initiation is to be seen as that deity of the initiation, and so on. But the idea of this transference of wisdom is a particular kind of Kagyu kind of perspective. So, at the same time, in the terms of Mahamudra, there's developed in the Karma Kagyu tradition a system of practicing the main part of Mahamudra in two stages. A first stage, which is effectively a kind of a version of Shine or Shamatha, calm abiding, and the second, which is again a specifically Mahamudra version of Vipassana, the insight meditation. And you can see that system reflected particularly in the works composed by the 9th Karmapa, Wanchuk Dorji, who wrote this trilogy, pointing a finger at the Dhammakaya, clarifying the clouds of unawareness, and the ocean of certainty. These three works, which differ only in length, in fact, set out not just the preliminary practices, but the key practices for calm abiding and Vipassana. So that is a kind of system one could train in, having completed the Tanunda, to go through those stages, either in practicing at home in daily sessions, or perhaps even better, practicing them in a period of retreat. And in one way, that could be sufficient for some people, just to practice that way, and they would effectively gain realization of Mahamudra. But for many people, and by many, I mean, of course, all this is now talking about people who are quite dedicated to practice, parallel to the Mahamudra path, so to speak, particularly at the high levels, is a path of practice based upon the Anuttara Yoga deities, and in particular three particular deities in Karma Kagyu are stressed: Vajra Yogini in her form as Dorji Pamo, Jawa Jamso, a particular Anuttara form of Chenrezig, and Chakasamvara in the form of the what's called the simultaneously rising or innate Chakrasamvara, because it's a special mandala that the Kagyus practice, a particular way of practicing Chakrasamvara, unique to not unique, but stressed in Karma Kagyu more than the other traditions. So these are three tantric yidams. Some lamas, in fact, like Karma Thinley Rinpoche himself, don't stress the necessity for practicing all three, and just rather concentrating on one alone, in this case, Dorji Pamo. But different lamas have different views on this. And accomplishing that yidam as development stage, and then for the completion stage, to practice the yogas known as the Narochudrak, or 6 dharmas, 6 teachings of Naropa. Again, the great Indian master Naropa, who is important both for Sakya and Kagyu. In Kagyu, he was one of the principal gurus of Marpa, to whom he gave this series of teachings known as the Narochudrak. And the Narochudrak, again, it's a system of practice, as in other completion stage practices, where your focus is on channeling the energies of the subtle body to bring about an experience of that at least is a reflective of enlightenment, at least like a reflection in which enlightenment, or true nature, can be seen through the bringing the winds and so on and elements into the central channel. So the Narochudrak begins with the practice of Tomo, the Chandali, which is very much associated with yogins like Milarepa, who are supreme masters of this practice. So of Chandali, of the yoga of luminosity, the yoga of the so the Chandali is taken mainly from the Hevajra Tantra, then luminosity, which is again found in the Chakasamvara Tantras, the yoga of the illusory body, which is some Guhya Samaja Tantra, the yogas of transference, of Poa, from the Mahamaya Tantra, the yoga of the dream state, transforming dreams, and the yoga of the Bardo, the yoga of transforming the intermediate state. These are 6 yogas of Naropa, and so they're the completion stage practices that are used in the Karma Kagyu tradition. They would be completed after having accomplished at least one of these major yidams. And all that is then to be practiced in parallel with the Mahamudra. So the Mahamudra approach is really, in a way, a formless approach, looking into the nature of mind. Even if you use the techniques of karma binding and vipassana, it does not involve ritual, it does not involve mantra, it does not involve visualization. But of course, those are characteristic of the other side, the taplam side, the skillful means path. So Mahamudra alone is drolam, liberation path. Taplam is skillful means path of yidam practice with visualization and mantras, and then the yogas of the subtle body. So that is, in a way, the most distinctive kind of structure of the path in the Karma Kagyu. Different lamas, even in the Karma Kagyu, present things somewhat slightly differently. For instance, there's the ninth Karmapa's trilogy is quite special and specific, in being so specific, one might say. The approach to Mahamudra that you find detailed by the 8th Sittu in his commentary on the Mahamudra aspiration prayer of Ranjan Dorji is not in contradiction to that, but is a little bit more fluid. And then also you have other strands of Mahamudra teaching in the Karma Kagyu, such as the teaching of the great 17th century yogin Karma Chame, or 16th century actually, Karma Chame, who even developed a stream of Mahamudra unified with Dzogchen, the primary practice of the Nyingma tradition. So, and that union of Mahamudra and Dzogchen is very popular among Karma Kagyus, particularly those from Eastern Tibet. And because it's a very simple form of practice, with a simple nundro and so on, and the only deity involved being Chenrezig, it's very popular and is commonly being taught quite a lot nowadays for those who don't have the time or inclination to practice the more detailed presentations of the Mahamudra and the tantric practices. So that another element that could be associated with the Karma Kagyu system is the practice of the chur or direct cutting, the severing practice, that's one better call it, the severing practice, which was popularized in Tibet by the great yogini Machik Labdron back in the 11th/12th centuries. Chur was actually an independent line of practice, but it has become combined, particularly through the works of the third Karmapa, with Mahamudra. So you can even talk about a Chur Mahamudra. So that is also quite commonly practiced in the Karma Kagyu, although perhaps it's best seen as an accompaniment to the main practices. So that is really, I would say, the distinctive practices. But nothing is ever so simple as what it appears to be through somebody explaining structures and so on and so forth. And the main thing, of course, in Karma Kagyu is the personal relationship with the Lama. It's, as I tried to say, it's at the heart of the Mahamudra transmission. And in regard to the Mahamudra transmission, though there are quite a lot of Lamas nowadays who can teach Mahamudra and the tantric teachings, really the primary holders of the Mahamudra transmission in Karma Kagyu are none other than Karmapa and Shamapa. They are the principal holders of, as it's called, the golden rosary of the Mahamudra transmission. So if one can receive transmission from them, then that would be best of all.